the Columbian Exchange refers to the period from 1492 to 1750, a period when the Old World, the world of Africa, of Europe, of Asia, so forth, really collides with that of the New World, North, South, and Central America, in a massive collision of worlds that has long-term transformative effects, not only for America, but also for the rest of the world. This is a map of the earliest phase of European colonization in the New World. This is New Spain and New Portugal. So, the area of what we call Portuguese Brazil is right here. This is the tip of Brazil, and this would be the area colonized by the Portuguese. In South America, all of these other areas down here are part of the Spanish Viceroyalty. You have the area of the Inca Empire in Peru here. This is Colombia and Panama up here. And of course, Spain also had control over these areas of Central America, Florida, areas of the Caribbean, and even up into areas of what is today the southwestern United States, were all incorporated into the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So as Spain expands and colonizes, it begins to exert its influence over the New World. This, of course, begins with the arrival of Columbus in 1492, which I'll talk about in a moment. The primary motivations of exploration into the New World were initially trade routes. It was really most about trade. Eventually, it becomes about resource-rich areas in the New World. So eventually, you'll see the Spanish domains in places like Mexico and in the Andes area of South America become associated with tremendous gold and silver. And so there's a tremendous amount of wealth in the form of resources that comes out of the New World. But initially, that wasn't the motivation. The initial motivation, of course, for Columbus, who was pursuing a trade route for the King and Queen of Spain, who was Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella were associated with the unification of Spain. And what Columbus was trying to do was to find a trade route to Asia. And you might say, well, why would he sail across the Atlantic Ocean to find it? And the reason was because no one knew that the mass of these two continents, the Americas, actually existed. And so the original goal with explorations across the Atlantic was to locate a trade route. Now, ultimately, when the Spanish discover the New World, it becomes about conquering and controlling the great empires of the Americas, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, and then plundering their wealth and eventually mining massive amounts of wealth, such as silver. So the motivations initially were really wealth for the nation. Initially, Portugal, so if you see Portugal right here on the very edge of the Iberian Peninsula, almost out of this picture, Portugal, they started exploring on the high seas before the Spanish. Now, Columbus was the first to cross the Atlantic. The Portuguese explored around the coast of Africa. And the initial motivations for the Portuguese were largely slave raiding, trying to capture slaves, and to try and obtain gold from what is today called the Gold Coast of West Africa. And so their motivation initially was not to cross the Atlantic, but again was plunder, wealth, and ultimately trade, and a trade route to India for the Portuguese. Trade with Asia, India, China, that's the real motivation. Western Europe consumes a lot of precious items from Asia, whether it's porcelain from China or spices from India. But before the Spanish and the Portuguese began exploring, they're able to obtain those, but they're really exotic items that are only obtainable in small quantities by the elites. And that's largely because they come across long-distance trade routes, and they pass through many, many hands, which raises the price, right? Well, the Portuguese and the Spanish both have the idea that if they can establish a direct trade linkage themselves, they can cut out the sort of middle entities, which were the Venetians in Italy, who were controlling Mediterranean trade. They were Muslim traders in the Arab world and the greater Islamic world who controlled trade routes as well, and mark that up. So they're seeking trade with Asia, though eventually you see the real wealth coming out of the incredible resources of the New World. There also was the focus on the expansion eventually of promoting Catholicism, and Catholic missionaries, particularly in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, went to great lengths to try to effectively come along with the explorers of the New World, to bring those ideas and to convert individuals to Catholicism. And of course, in many parts of Latin America, those efforts at conversion were brutal. And we saw in places like Maya areas of places like the Yucatan Peninsula, which is here. These are the areas of the Yucatan and Guatemala. These are the parts of where you would find the Maya. You saw really like versions of Spanish Inquisition, which was the Spanish Inquisition was the attempt to rid Western Europe of heretics and non-Catholic individuals. And Ferdinand and Isabella, who unified Spain, were also associated with intense anti-Semitism and persecution of Jewish people, as well as Islamic people. The Muslim populations actually controlled Spain, much of Spain at that point, or at least at that point, southern areas of Spain. And Ferdinand and Isabella actually pushed them out of the Iberian Peninsula. So converts and religious zeal was another motivation for these explorations. Early exploration, European exploration. Now we know, of course, that the Danes, the Vikings, were the first sort of to cross the Atlantic. We know that Viking explorers like Leif Erikson had established routes across the Atlantic, and we know that the Danes, the Vikings, established settlements in areas like northern North America, for example. There's been findings in Greenland, and there have also been findings in other areas of what is today Canada that suggest that there were Viking settlements established. But those Viking settlements, which would have occurred during the High Middle Ages, weren't permanent. They weren't long-lasting and permanent. Those settlements died out. And as a result of that, we talk about the beginning of European exploration with the exploration of the Portuguese and Spanish. And it's because the Portuguese and the Spanish established permanent and lasting trade routes and colonial domains. European exploration in the 1400s by the Portuguese and the Spanish was made possible by the development of a ship known as the Caravel. It's a Portuguese ship. And the Portuguese ship, the Caravel, it's a small ship. This is a drawing of the Caravel. It's not a huge ship, though it is the basis for the massive wooden-built ships of the pre-industrial age, the sailing ships, the great sailing ships of this period. And this was a ship that was really, it was commissioned and developed really by the Portuguese, and they very much led the way on European exploration. But this ship itself was built on key technological developments that were owed to that world historical phenomenon, global interconnectivity. It was owed to the interconnections of the world because it incorporated things like, for example, the Lantine sail, which was a sail. It incorporated a rudder on the stern of the ship, a technological development usually associated with the Chinese. It incorporated a compass, the Astrolabe. And the Astrolabe is an old device that was largely preserved from actually the age of antiquity. the Hellenistic age in the Mediterranean, the age of the Greeks and the Romans, but it was preserved for years and years and years by Muslim traders on the high seas. And this too was incorporated into the Portuguese Caravel. So new sail technologies, new navigational technologies, these technologies were so fundamental to this vessel, and more or less all of them were things that had come into Portuguese hands on the Iberian Peninsula, largely through the sharing and interconnections of ideas and technologies from the world. So this was a really important development, but one that owed itself to the interconnections of the world. The Caravel was developed and used first by the Portuguese navigator named Prince Henry the Navigator. He's a Portuguese figure, and he had established what was called the School of the Navigators, and it was designed to train Portuguese mariners to be able to sail on the seas. Prince Henry the Navigator, however, we will see the Portuguese will eventually sail all the way around the Horn of Africa, and under Vasco da Gama they will create a trade route to India, not crossing the Atlantic, but rather sailing around the coast of Africa. Prince Henry the Navigator himself did not have that as his original motivation. His original motivation was effectively to try and capture slaves from West Africa and to obtain gold from West Africa. But nonetheless, his role in training mariners and using this new ship technology will create a pattern of exploration for the Portuguese that will eventually take them to the south of the African continent, eventually around that continent and up to India. And I'll show you a map of that here in a second. Other factors in European exploration at this time, we're talking about creating, really, at this time, what you're talking about here, European exploration on the high seas is creating, over the long term, an interconnected global trade network. That is, we know that the old world was interconnected with trade networks, but with European exploration, as it begins to advance, you start to see a more rapid and thoroughly interconnected world through trade on the high seas. This sort of rapid globalization that starts to happen, this interconnection of a world system, is really made possible by knowledge and experience from these mariners, learning about trade winds. You don't sail at certain times of the monsoon, for example. There's times of the year you sail to India. There's times of year you leave India. Understanding the ocean currents, understanding that if you take your ship with the predominant ocean currents, that you can make the route faster and much more easy in terms of speed and much more efficiently as well than would be if you tried to go to the areas where those currents were not predominant. Maps are incredibly important for the development of European exploration in the process of this global interconnection and global creation of like a world system, effectively, global trade. When Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, and when he went to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, he was motivated by a map that was called Ptolemy's geography. Ptolemy was an old philosopher and thinker, scientist, if you will, from the age of antiquity, the Hellenistic age. Ptolemy had created this idea of the world and other things, and it encouraged explorers like Columbus because Ptolemy's geography significantly underplayed the circumference of the world. And I will show you a map of Ptolemy's geography in a second, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So Ptolemy's geography was important because it encouraged explorers like Columbus, because as you see from this map, it very much underemphasizes the size of the oceans and overemphasizes the land masses. So if you look at this map, this is the type of map that would have motivated Columbus. You see that this map is a really flawed map. There is no end to Africa effectively. The oceans are very small. There's no America on this map. And so if you were working with a map like this, Columbus would naturally assume that if the world is round, if he sails to the west from this way, this would be Spain right here. If he sails this way, that he should arrive over here in Asia. So he's motivated by this. He thinks that if this map is reasonably accurate, then a trade route across the Atlantic should be an ideal way to establish a permanent trade route with Asia and cut out the various middlemen in this part of the world who were controlling the long distance trade routes of goods from China and India. So Ptolemy's geography, the type of map that Columbus used, encourages explorers like Columbus because the oceans are so poorly represented. In fact, we know the world is almost exclusively made up of water. At least there's a lot more water on the earth than there is land. And the oceans are far bigger than the continents. And of course, the Americas is the massive area in between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Making the transition to a rapid globalization possible was really made possible by the development of a map called the Mercator Projection. And it's named after Gerardus Mercator, who was a Danish map maker. And this map is really significant because, and as you see, we're talking about the 1500s, so we're talking about the development of this map not long after the voyages of Columbus, in the 1500s. And this map is a map that, along with knowledge of trade winds and ocean currents, along with technology in ship development, the map of Gerardus Mercator will really, really be important to creating these long-distance seafaring trade routes that increase the pace of globalization in the world to an unprecedented level. So let's take a look at the Mercator Projection. Now, the one I'm going to show you is a modern rendition of the Mercator Projection. This is not an original map, but it's an example of what a Mercator Projection looks like. What Mercator did with this, before I show it to you, is you have the globe, the world, sort of laid flat. And all of the areas of the world are disseminated by true lines of direction on a grid, lines of latitude and lines of longitude. And that makes it possible for a seafarer to sort of better locate where they're at and how long a journey is to take. So here, the kind of map Columbus was working for, when Columbus, who was from Italy, he's from Genoa, Italy, when Columbus sailed for the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, he was using this type of map, Ptolemy's geography. The Earth's circumference is hugely underestimated. The oceans are far smaller than they actually are, and there's no America either. So it encourages Columbus to sail to across the Atlantic, in his mind, to Asia, when in fact he will run into the islands of the Caribbean, first the island of San Salvador in the Americas. This is what a modern Mercator projection looks like. If you see, the world is on a flat surface, which is why, by the way, Antarctica looks so huge and Greenland is far bigger than it is, because in this type of projection, the land masses that are at the poles are exaggerated in size. But the point is the map is laid on a grid, lines of longitude and latitude. And that makes it possible, again, Portugal right here, Spain right here, it makes it possible for a navigator to sail and to be able to chart their distance on the basis of this grid-like formation, and to then position, using these degrees, position themselves in the world. The development, it was largely a Dutch development. The Netherlands is right here, the Dutch Republic. The Dutch were one of the most preeminent exploring powers following in the 1600s, really, following the Spanish and the Portuguese. And one thing that they developed that really revolutionized seafaring as well was the development of a reliable shipboard clock. So the development of a clock that could keep time in your home port, and then you could effectively use that clock to track how long your voyage is taking and, you know, figure out exactly whereabouts you're on the map, your position. And of course, traveling north to south, you would use something like the Astrolabe, which was designed to locate your position by measuring the movements of the stars on the horizon. And so when you move north to south, it's much easier to find your position because as you move further south, the more southern constellations you would see in the sky, stars in the sky.